This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. Still talking about Wilds of Eldraine. We're pretty deep in the format now, and at this point I want to go ahead and do my archetype tier list where I talk about each of the two color pairs, what each of them is trying to do in the format, and what makes them good or bad in this particular format. So let's start at the bottom with number 10, where I've got blue-white. So I don't think there's any color pair in the format that is entirely unplayable, but there is undoubtedly a worst deck in the format that's in this bottom tier, and there's actually a second one too, but we're talking about blue-white first. This is supposed to be the tap deck, going into the format. Looking at how the deck worked and what the payoffs were, it was pretty clear to me that this deck really wasn't going to work out as a synergistic deck, and that is mostly true. There is the Mythic Rare, and then there's some other cards, the rare Crown, which can tap things. Like, sometimes you can get rares and mythics that will make this deck go the extra mile, but most of the time, if you're playing a good blue-white deck, it's just like a tempo aggro deck, and that's just what it is. It's not a deck that's trying to get tap synergies going. All of those cards have pretty much underperformed. So have the cards that tap things. So it's kind of a bad combination. And so basically the reason this deck ends up not working out is because the thing that they wanted you to do synergy-wise in this color pair very, very rarely comes together. And additionally, blue has some serious problems in the format, namely that it doesn't have very many 2-drops that are very good. There is, I want to talk about a key common for each of the color pairs. And generally speaking, I think the common that can really get this deck going sometimes is Snare Master Sprite. It's pretty nice on turn one. Like, one of the problems is blue doesn't have early drops, right? Well, this is one. And then in the later game, you can get a blocker out of the way and attack and stuff like that. So basically, though, this deck isn't going to be a synergy deck 99% of the time. I mean, there's going to be like 1 out of 100 times where you actually draft a synergistic version of this deck that actually performs well. And when that happens, it's cool and all. But yeah, this is the worst deck in the format. It doesn't come together. There aren't that many different directions you can go in. Like, you're kind of locked in on being sort of an aggro tempo deck. Being a control deck doesn't work that well, even though you're in blue. So overall, blue-white, definitely the worst deck in the format. So the other deck in this bottom tier is blue-green. This is another deck where it just doesn't really come together in terms of synergy. They wanted this to be a blue-green ramp deck, right? That's what the signpost and comment tells you. And there are some payoffs for it, for sure. But basically, the idea of trying to be a ramp deck in this format, it's not a great idea, generally speaking. You need to be adding to the board early, and there are ways to do it. You can get there. And I do think this deck is significantly better than blue-white, I should say. And part of the reason for that is if you're in blue-green, you have access to fixing. And I don't hate blue-green being sort of the base of a 4 or 5 color deck. You're still not really a blue-green deck when you do that. Like, a straight-up blue-green deck is almost never going to be something you want to do. But this deck will have access to things like Hatching Plans and the 1 green mana card that lets you search your library for a land. And if you bargain, you make a land into a 3/3. Like, if you can get those things going in any deck, you end up in a pretty good place. You can play multiple colors in blue-green pretty easily. And so, if you get there on fixing, which you can do, you're no longer really a blue-green deck. Like, you almost never, like I want to say, you almost never want to be just like, hey, I'm a blue-green ramp deck. You want to be a blue-green deck with sort of a base that's blue-green that has the ability to play a whole bunch of good cards, off-color adventures, any bombs you get. Like, this is one of the best bases for that kind of deck. But as a blue-green deck itself, that's not really where you want to be. All right, so now we're moving into tier 2. These are decks that I do think, come together reasonably often. If they're open, you end up with a good enough deck to be competitive. All right, so let's move into tier 2 now. Tier 2, this is all decks that come together reasonably often, and they can be competitive, if you picked the right lane, basically. So at the bottom of this tier, I have blue-red. So, 8, 9, and 10 on this list are blue decks. That sort of tells you something about blue and the format overall. But yeah, blue-red is supposed to be a spell deck, and it can be. Like, there are, you're going to have some spell synergies, but some of the cards that were supposed to be key for the deck, like the Catapult, which, sometimes you can really go off with it, sure. But overall, it's in a really awkward position in this format because a 0/4 on turn 3 is just not it's not enough. You know, when your opponent's just curving out against you and they can just run this thing over with half a card because they use a combat trick that's on an adventure creature, like that's a nightmare. And that's what happens like all the time if you try to play the catapults like out on curve. And that's a pretty big problem. I do think blue-red can be a control deck. You know, I don't think it's in as good of a position as some of the other grindy decks in the format that have access to more life gain in the form of food. But in blue-red, you do have access to just like a bunch of really efficient cards that let you interact with the board, especially in red. But even in blue, you know, you have access to things like Spell Stutter, which works well in this style of deck. That's the 2-mana counter spell. But I think kind of the key common for this deck for me is something like Skewer Slinger. The Slinger, you know, works out as a defensive creature. That's pretty nice. Like, and that's important. Like you need, you know, I said you have to be aggressive or assertive. Skewer Slinger is something that is assertive. It can block everything early, and it's even impossible to attack into for a lot of things. Anything with, you know, 2 toughness dies, it can trade with it. And anything with only 1 toughness becomes incapable of attacking. So if you're trying to set up sort of a long game, something basically none of the other red decks in the format want to do, Skewer Slinger works out pretty well. And this is pretty much the only deck for it. You don't have to go after it early or anything like that. But I like having like 2 of these in my blue-red decks where I'm trying to make the game go longer using removal. You know, again, doing stuff with hatching plans is always a great way to win the game in this format if you're in blue. And then, you know, eventually playing some big threats in the later stage of the game that let you really take over, you know, thanks to the card advantage you have too. Sometimes you don't even need big threats in this format. You just need to, you know, draw extra cards with hatching plans or the 5-mana draw 3. Either of those often is how you can win a game in like a blue control deck in this format, and blue-red can definitely do it. But yeah, Skewer Slinger is kind of the card I think of that's sort of special to this deck in a way, extra good in this deck because it doesn't really fit anywhere else. And it's not an amazing card, but this is the deck where you kind of want it. So next up at number 7, I've got Black-White. So this is like kind of our 4th consecutive deck in the format where the synergy angle didn't get there. The synergy here is supposed to be stuff goes to your graveyard, enchantments go to your graveyard, and you get value out of it. That's supposed to be what you're doing here. That's, you know, and basically every card that has that text on it, like when an enchantment goes to your graveyard, something happens, they're all performing really, really poorly in this format. So this is another deck that is less into synergy, our 4th consecutive one here at the bottom of the list, but we are in tier 2 here, where you're just going to be like a good stuff deck most of the time. Now, I will say, you know, maybe you don't have access to hatching plans, which is like the best thing to bargain. But the one thing that Black-White does have going for it is access to a bunch of nice bargain cards and lots of nice bargain fodder. So you do still have those things going on, but even though you're doing that, you don't really want any of those cards that say when an enchantment goes to your graveyard, something happens. I mean, some of them are passable. One of them's a 2-mana 2/2. It's hard to go super wrong there, but like the 3-mana 2/3 that gets a counter isn't very good. Even the Signpost uncommon is surprisingly mediocre. You know, it's not bad, but it's worse than you would think. And that's a real good sign that, you know, Black-White isn't really a synergy deck. You're just mostly, again, a fairly aggressive deck that's doing some stuff with bargain. And I think the Signpost common here, the common that I really like for this deck, that I think this is just the best deck for it, is Hopeless Nightmare. There is, of course, the other Hope enchantment, but we'll talk about that one later. I have it as a key common for a different deck, which also works here. But Hopeless Nightmare works well here. Hurts your opponent, which can give you some late game reach. Also, just on turn 1, making your opponent lose a card is good. And then you can just bargain it away later and get Scry 2 out of it. So this is a really nice deck for it. Playing it on turn 1 feels good. Playing it later in the game feels good. But yeah, Black-White, mostly an aggro deck that has like a little tiny enchantment sub-theme. So yeah, so far talking about 4 decks that not especially synergistic. They all had synergy themes, but they all kind of fell flat for one reason or another. You don't have to have synergy, though, in this format, and that, you know, that's something I said early on, that it didn't feel like you needed it, and you don't really in a lot of the decks. Even the deck we're going to look at the top of this second tier isn't really that much of a synergy deck. So, you know, you don't have to have it to be good, but the fact that these bottom 4, 3 of which are blue decks, again, the fact that they didn't get there on synergy ends up hurting like the number of directions you can go in with them, which makes it harder for a good deck to sort of come together. Next, let's talk about green-white, which is an enchantment deck. I do think this one is fairly synergistic. You know, it's not a deck you have to have synergy in by any stretch, but you do have it. I mean, you have a Signpost Uncommon that's really strong, that gets better the more roll tokens you have lying around, basically. You've got some nice other payoffs. The 3-mana 2/3 that draws you a card when an aura enters the battlefield, for example, is like an amazing payoff that can really bring one of these decks together. But this is yet another, you know, aggro deck, right? That's just what it is. I mean, you've got roll tokens. You like playing the 3-mana 2/3 that puts a roll token on something, and that is what I think is the key common for this particular deck. Because generally you're going to be playing something at least on turn 2. Playing that on turn 3 is often a really good start. And then if you have some enchantment payoffs of various kinds, Red Tooth Genealogist, that's what it's called. It'll be on the screen, but you know, I couldn't remember its name for a second there. Yeah, it comes down, puts a roll token on something, usually makes your board better. You're almost always going to have something else to put it on. So, you know, you don't always. Sometimes your opponent kills the thing. But, you know, this thing does exactly what this deck wants to do. Has a decent body. You know, it adds 3/4 worth of stats to the board for 3 mana, and it lets you just keep turning your creatures sideways while giving you this little bit of enchantment synergy that this color pair is interested in. All right, so now we're moving into the top half, the top sort of 5 decks in the format. And I do have one blue deck there. You know, blue I don't think is a great color, as I've said numerous times in this video, and as evidenced by the fact that there were 3 color pairs were the bottom. But I do have blue-black as the 5th best deck in this format, the 5th best color pair. This is one where, like, the synergy angle also didn't really get there, but it ends up not mattering as much. So this is supposed to be a fairy deck. And it can be, but there aren't actually that many fairy payoffs at lower rarities. I think the key common for this deck, I think there's 2 of them, and it's because 2-drops are so important, and these are both fairy-related 2-drops. So I wanted to talk about them both. Spell Stutter and Barrow Naughty. These both are really, really good in this format. And like a lot of blue commons aren't good, but Spell Stutter is super important for those blue decks because it's something you can do on turn 2 that you're almost always going to get to cast on turn 2 or turn, you know, your opponent's turn 3 because people are just curving out in this format. And then in this deck, you're likely to have 1 or 2 fairies lying around late so that it stays relevant longer, and that's nice too. But it's really nice in your opening hand, unlike a lot of blue 2-drops in this format. And then Barrow Naughty is the 2-mana 1/3 that gets lifelink if you control another fairy. Obviously, that's a fairy payoff, you know, and these are 2 fairy payoffs that do add sort of a little more synergy to this deck. But beyond these 2, you don't find yourself doing that much fairy stuff unless you have the Signpost Uncommon. But the reason Barrow Naughty is good is because it gains you life, and that's basically all there is to it. It can really make a race difficult for an aggressive opponent, and most of your opponents are going to be aggressive. So, you know, Barrow Naughty is great at just, first of all, coming down, and it can block rats. It can block a lot of stuff. You know, tricks are a big problem in this format. It makes blocking harder than usual, but, you know, it can block when it needs to, and it also makes the race a lot harder for your aggressive opponents to win, who are just trying to curve out and win before, you know, create a board state where by turn 5 where you just can't win anymore. Barrow Naughty often disrupts that kind of game plan between the body and the life gain, so it's really nice. And these are both 2-drops, of course, which again, super important in this format. So both of these are cards that I have liked, especially in blue-black. But mostly, this deck ends up being kind of a control deck. You know, it's one of the decks that can get away without being super aggressive, partly thanks to Spell Stutter and Barrow Naughty. Then you have access to lots of good removal. You've got counter magic like the Spell Stutter and Ice Out. You've got some nice bargain stuff going on because you have hatching plans around. You have Into the Fey Court. Like all of these things, if you can make the game go long, which Spell Stutter and Barrow Naughty can help you do, can help you win the game in the long run. And then the top deck that I have in tier 2 is red-green. Here, you know, this is another deck at the top of this tier that didn't really get there on the big synergy thing that it wanted to do, which is ramp and creatures with power 4 or greater. Those things come up, you know, kind of like in the blue-black deck. Like, it comes up a little bit, but it's not like this huge synergistic part of the deck. You're not picking up synergy pieces and stuff like that so much as you're drafting a red-green aggro deck. You know, red and green has access to some really nice combat tricks, which makes it pretty good. But like with blue-green that we talked about earlier, red-green has access to fixing that can allow it to be a multicolor deck really easily. I have Root Rider Fawn as the key common here because it fixes your mana. It ramps you too. So, you do ramp some in this format, but trying to play 7 and 8 mana cards and stuff like that, like the, set kind of wants you to, is kind of a death sentence. But you do want to ramp into like your 4-drop on turn 3, and you want to be able to play your off-color adventures to make your cards better. Just being able to jam all the best cards you drafted into your deck. That's what makes a deck like blue-green work sometimes, and that's what can make red-green work as well. But the difference with red-green is that the base deck, even if you don't go multicolor, is actually pretty good too. So it's not quite as, like with blue-green, you kind of have to do it or you're not going to end up in a good place. With red-green, you can just be sort of a red-green aggro deck that, just curves out and attacks your opponent. That's not really something you have access to at all in blue-green, which is part of what makes it a pretty big problem in the format. So that is tier 2. We've got 3 decks in tier 1. All 3 of these are decks that usually, the colors that they are in are so deep and the card quality is so high that like 2 drafters at most tables can end up drafting each of these color pairs and end up with a really good deck because they're just that good. So at the bottom of this first tier, I have black-green. So this is the food deck. It is the deck that does the best against all of these more aggressive decks, which is most of them in the format. Spoiler alert, the top 2 decks that we're going to talk about in this tier, they're aggro decks. While I have them higher than black-green, black-green is a deck that is a nightmare matchup for those decks because you have access to all these like efficient creatures that just come into play and make food, and food helps you gain life. And that, again, like I said when talking about Baronati, gaining life is the thing that you can do that really makes life difficult for these aggressive decks. And then the card that really brings this deck together, the card that will make your aggro opponent groan every time you slam it on, sometimes on turn 4 if you have a little bit of ramp, but certainly on turn 5 is Hamlet Glutton, which I have as the key common for this deck. I thought about putting the 3-mana 3/2 Witch that makes a food here, which is also quite good for a variety of reasons. It's one of those creatures that comes into play, makes a food, but then it's a pretty powerful food payoff. But Hamlet Glutton is the one I went with because of what the metagame looks like in this format. You're going to be playing against aggro decks like 80% of the time in this format, and Hamlet Glutton is an absolute monster against them. Those decks like to play tricks, but their creatures are pretty small. Even most tricks can't make them big enough to punch through a Hamlet Glutton, and then the Glutton gains you 3 life while adding this huge body to the board. I mean, we get a card like that in basically every format at common. They try to put one in to combat aggro decks, and it usually works out. It usually ends up being a good common, but this might be the best one we've ever had just because you can play it so early, which will really stymie your opponent. I mean, if your opponent stumbled at all and they're an aggro deck and you play Hamlet Glutton, the game's basically over. And then even if they were curving out on you and you killed like maybe one thing in that amount of time or traded or whatever, playing Hamlet Glutton can still basically turn the game around for you, and that's what makes it so important for this deck. As expensive as it is to cast, I mean, you usually pay 5. I like to have like 2 of them in most of my decks because it's such a good common. And yeah, I mean, if you've played against it as an aggro deck, you know how it feels. And if you've played with it as not an aggro deck in this format, you also know how it feels. And it's an important card in the format and one of the best commons around, and definitely the key common for me for black-green. So, as I promised, the top 2 decks are, of course, aggro decks, and they have a lot of similarities. At number 2, I have black-red. You could kind of put either of these, I don't know, 1A and 1B, but at number 2, I've got black-red. This is the rat deck. It does actually, the synergy actually matters on a few cards like Tattered Ratter, and of course your Signpost uncommon. That all matters. But the big synergy thing in the deck is more going wide than it is actual rats. I mean, the rats matter and all because that's how you go wide. But, this deck is the best one in the format at going wide. It can get the most mileage out of gnawing Crescendo, the mass pump effect that makes rats. And it can just curve out and then get a bunch of bodies in play and swing for lethal incredibly quickly. I have the key common here is Ratcatcher Trainee. It does exactly what this deck wants to do. You can play it on turn 2 as a pretty nice 2-drop. It does feel bad sometimes when you do that because there are so many ways to punish X1s in this format. Like if your opponent casts Rat Out or flick a coin on it, doesn't feel great. So in an ideal world, you get all 3 bodies out of this, but sometimes you got to cast this on turn 2. But yeah, when it really becomes good is when you can get all 3 bodies out of it, which does exactly what the deck wants to do. Helps you go wide, gives you bargain fodder. It helps you just be aggressive. It does everything you want to do. So black red, a very good aggro deck with access to a lot of nice ways to go wide and lots of nice bargain fodder too. I do think, like I said, it's 1A and 1B, but for me, at least right now, red-white edges out black-red just a little bit. And red-white's big synergy thing is Celebration. And I think the thing that makes this deck the best is that they got there on the synergy in this color pair, and then it's just like got the best creatures to curve out with in the format too. Basically, Celebration is you get some sort of special effect if you had 2 non-land permanents enter the battlefield that turn. And there's a lot of good aggressive creatures with it. The 2 mana 2/2 that gets +1/+1 and trample, for example. The 3 mana 3/3 that can give +1/+0 and menace to things. Like, getting Celebration going is something you want to do. Like, it really makes your turns a lot better. And the thing that makes this deck so good is there's just like all these commons that just let you sort of curve out and make Celebration happen. And the one that I have as the key common here is Hopeful Vigil, because it does exactly that. It can give you Celebration, gives you 2 bodies. If you have a way to bounce it to your hand, like stockpiling Celebrant, things get really silly because you can just keep triggering Celebration. But it doesn't just end there. I mean, you have the 3 mana 2/3 that makes a treasure. You have the 4 mana 3/3 menace that makes a 1/1 rat. So you can just end up like curving out with things that say Celebration on them, and then having turn after turn after turn where you trigger it. And you usually don't need that many because you were curving out anyway, and like 2 Celebration triggers is usually enough for you to win the game. So yeah, I mean, I feel like this deck got there the most on synergy in any deck in the format, and then it's just got a great curve out, access to good enough removal and good tricks that it just ends up being the best deck in the format. Again, black-red is right there knocking on the door, and black-green's really not that far back either. And like I said, versus each other, like black-green has the better matchup than either of the against both of these. Meanwhile, black-red and red-white are probably better against the rest of the field, but you're going to be seeing a lot of these because they are so good, and multiple drafters at a table can have good versions of these decks. So those are my tiers for this limited format, Wilds of Eldraine. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Nizzanotes. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.